Now, globalization clearly has had an effect on gender socialization in traditional societies, even in places that are really, really, really remote, like rural Mexico or the Brazilian rainforest or Africa. And globalization is trying to have an effect on North Africa and Muslim countries regarding female circumcision. And we generally make no apology for that because our society considers it to be so wrong, whether that is ethnocentric of us or not. But even with globalization in these less developed countries, yes, more regular contact with the rest of the world is making gender distinctions less pronounced in many ways. Still, for the most part, adolescent girls in traditional societies still have much less opportunity available to them. They still have a very, very narrow prospect for their life, whether it's in terms of education or occupation or other things. Gender distinctions are slightly less distinct, but that hasn't necessarily led to a huge shift in equality for girls in these societies. And this isn't just a lack of equality compared with boys in their own countries, but also compared to girls in the West. For example, we know that girls are much less likely to go to school than boys in some countries. That's just the way it is. And they're especially less likely to attend high school. And this is for a few reasons. One, because if they attend school, that means that their family loses the benefit of their labor at home. And the families rely on their labor. And second, because in these traditional societies, traditionally, when a female marries, they then go with their husband's family. So their family is not going to get the lifelong benefit of their female child being educated because girls tend to leave the house after marriage. So globalization may have an effect on this because these countries are increasingly industrialized. Just the everyday daily contact with other countries. But this is a very, very, very slow process. And something that really does contribute to maintaining these traditional gender roles in traditional societies is something that we can't change, and that's the fact that only females are capable of having children. And because they are the ones that are capable of having children, that means that they're the ones who are responsible for child rearing. Um, in addition, they do not usually have access to reliable birth control or reliable, accurate knowledge about birth control. Um, and by that I mean in terms of tracking their menstrual cycle. So when are they most likely to get pregnant during their cycle? It's not uncommon for women in these countries to spend a few decades essentially doing nothing but having children and raising them. And I think we tend to forget just what a huge, enormous effect access to safe and reliable and affordable birth control has had for women in terms of what their daily life is like. Globalization has had an effect in terms of birth rates. Um, Economic development occurs, more contact with other communities, meaning there's increased access to contraception. Whether that means the actual contraception itself or access to information, because as I said, in a menstrual cycle, a woman is most likely to be impregnated during ovulation, which is 12 to 14 days before her period starts. So, what access to accurate information regarding preventing pregnancy does is it makes a female's adult role less focused on childbearing and child rearing alone. They're still going to have children, and in more traditional countries, probably more children on average than here. But very slowly over time, they will not be solely defined by their reproductive capabilities. Um, and very slowly over time, they will begin to socialize their families differently, their daughters differently, because as their daughters grow older and enter adolescence, they won't have as many younger siblings to provide assistance for. And again, this is an extremely, extremely slow process. And absolutely, you could argue whether this is a positive development or not. Is the rest of the world being ethnocentric by encouraging other societies and cultures to do things differently because we judge the way they are to be lacking? And I totally understand that logic. It's the same logic used in part on defensive female circumcision. Or we can argue that globalization in these less developed, more traditional countries is not so much about changing them, but just making them aware of something different. But just by making them aware of something different, are we then changing them? The United Nations, in its work, has clearly stated that because of globalization, young people in developing countries tend to have less conservative perceptions of gender roles than previous generations. So each successive generation is changing what these roles mean for the next generation, and that occurs in every society. I don't find this surprising. It just makes sense to me that generational gaps are emerging because this has always happened, but usually regarding things that are far less serious. So, the first generation that grew up with rock and roll compared to the generation before it. The world changes, simple as that. And because of that, each generation is raised slightly different from the one before it. So this shouldn't be surprising. What is surprising to me, and maybe this is just me, is what is having such an impact. It isn't computers, and it isn't the internet specifically. It is cell phones. A person no longer has to have a computer to have complete access to the World Wide Web and all of the perspectives and attitudes and points of view contained on it in just a few seconds. This is bound to have an effect. There is no way it can't. Being influenced by other languages, other words, other music, other religions, food, clothing, other ideas about politics or just social organization, or dating, or marriage, or pregnancy, or child rearing, or even methods of disciplining children, and so on and so on. And in Africa, what this map shows is the average age of people who own a cell phone in these different countries in Africa. I remember reading somewhere that there are more cell phones in Africa at this point than there are flush toilets, which I think is really interesting. Now, if we jump back to gender in Western society, Western societies that are not traditional in nature like ours, we like to think of our society being so much more advanced than others in terms of gender roles and gender socialization. And let's be honest, maybe in a little bit of an uppity way. But adolescent girls in Western society today have not always had this huge, wide range of opportunities and life experiences that they enjoy now. So, in the same way that when we look at adolescents in traditional cultures, we can see real disparities in socialization of males and females, a lot more rigid ideas. Looking at adolescence in Western history, we can see a similar pattern. If you look at the history of Canada and the United States, what it meant to grow from a girl to a woman has been very different from what it meant to grow from a boy to a man. So for adolescent girls growing up in Canada or the US in the middle class in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were pretty constricted. They had a lot of constraints put on them, very controlled, much, much more than adolescent girls today in pretty much every way you can think of. They really had very few options open to them in terms of education, social opportunities, work, everything. If a woman were to actually work for a paycheck, there were very few professions considered appropriate. Teacher, nurse, seamstress, not including all of the low wage labor, lower status women participated in. So like a maid of all work, a laundress, something like that. But because this is a sociology course, we're going to take a closer look at the restrictions all women were subject to at this time, which dictated what the experience of adolescent would have been like. At this time, adolescent girls were subject to really, really strong cultural perceptions that they were fragile and innocent. They needed to be taken care of. They required special care. And I know all of this sounds pretty silly to us now, but for example, it was women's perceived fragility that was one of the main arguments put forth to absolutely deny them the opportunity to work in most occupations. Intellectual work was considered unhealthy. And if a woman taxed herself too much intellectually, it might even interfere with her ability to reproduce, to have children. So, this view that women were inherently fragile and innocent was thought to be connected to really sound, reliable medical advice. That a woman who was involved in any kind of intellectual work, that all her energy would be drawn to her brain and away from her ovaries, thus disrupting her menstrual cycle and endangering her health. And again, we can giggle about this, understandably. But at the same time, I want you to recognize that this is a really good example of something that was thought to be a sex difference based on biology. Women were viewed as biologically less capable of intellectual work, but it was actually a gender difference rooted in cultural beliefs. It was socially and culturally constructed. And of course, girls were viewed as too weak to do any kind of physical work, which I always find so odd, not because I'm of a different generation and recognize how silly that is, but because I recognize how silly these notions were, because at the same time, women of a lower socioeconomic status were working their butts off day in and day out alongside their husbands in fields and homesteads, eventually in industrialized businesses, which often involved physical labor. So the view that adolescent females were incapable of strenuous work is also in very sharp contrast to the expectations we have seen in traditional cultures, where adolescent girls worked alongside their mothers with near adult responsibilities. So there's a real disconnect here, isn't there? It just doesn't make sense. Now, this exclusion from work for adolescent girls and women, supposedly for their own good and their own mental and physical health, applied mainly to adolescent girls in the middle class. So historically, they were restricted in terms of education and restricted in terms of occupation. And sexuality is a third area where the lives of middle class girls were very narrowly restricted. Until about the 1920s, virginity until marriage was considered absolutely essential for adolescent girls. And I do mean essential. It was not just a preference, it was a requirement. And it isn't that from about the 1920s onwards, maintaining your virginity was no longer important. It's just that up until that time, it was absolutely required. Even the word hymen was rarely used if the subject of virginity should be brought up. Instead, girls were taught that they had a treasure or a flower or some kind of jewel that they should only give to their husband on their wedding night. At least in part because of this emphasis on virginity until marriage, this means that girls were kept as innocent as possible in every way you can possibly think of, at least middle and upper class girls. Even if they were engaged to somebody, there's a pretty good chance they would not have spent a single second alone with the person they were intended to marry. They would have always been supervised. And this also meant that many girls were never told about menstruation. It's estimated that about half of American adolescent girls were entirely unprepared for the first time they got their period, which in all seriousness must have been very startling and for some downright terrifying when it happened. Because, I mean, imagine it. You are not feeling well, you have cramping in your stomach, and then all of a sudden you start to bleed from somewhere you've never bled from before. And if you really have no idea what's going on, it was probably pretty scary. All of this was done with the intent of shielding young women from anything that could possibly be connected to sex or even a hint of sex. So clearly, what this means is at the time, there is a connection between menstruation and sexual activity, which seems odd for us, but I want you to remember something. At the time, most girls would go through menarche later than they do today, maybe around 15 or 16. And at that time, marriage occurred earlier. Age of mother at their first birth was earlier. So it just seemed to be like a natural connection between all that. Now, girls on average get their period for the first time much earlier and they marry much later. So the two are not perceived to have this automatic connection. It wasn't until the 1940s that menstruation and information about it was thought to be important to provide to young girls. Now, a fourth area of constriction for adolescent females historically, one you may not necessarily think of, was physical appearance. We know that the current slim ideal of female appearance can be hard, especially for girls when they reach puberty, when they tend to put on a little bit of weight. And for a lot of girls and women, they spend their entire life trying to reach this thin ideal that they're told they should reach. So having an ideal of physical appearance is not new. That's not something that our generation has the patent on. It's always been there. For example, until the early 20th century, most middle-class girls would wear some version of a corset, which was designed to push up the breasts and make the waist very small. I'm a big Gone with the Wind fan, and of course this reminds me of the scene in Gone with the Wind when Scarlett O'Hara's mammy is trying to tie her corset as tight as possible, and they're trying to get it to 18 inches after she's had a child. Now, the constriction of the corset, if it's too tight, can actually cause real physical problems. It can cause a woman to have difficulty breathing. As we saw on the previous slide, it can even actually constrict the rib cage because they're doing this every day, day in and day out. It can make it difficult to take a full breath. It can irritate the skin. And by the 1920s, thankfully, corsets were rarely used. Instead, they were replaced by a brassiere, which we now just refer to as a bra. But the 1920s also brought in new requirements for female appearance. So a new ideal, a new standard that girls everywhere of all ages were told that they should live up to. And this was a boyish figure with very, very minimal breasts. And by the way, the 1920s is when shaving legs and underarms first began to become popular in American women. Now, if we change this or go a little bit further in history, this changed again in the 1950s. So by the 1950s, a boyish figure was out, and instead, bigger breasts were in. So in the 1950s, there was kind of a preoccupation with bras and a variety of techniques for increasing your breast size or at least making it look like your breasts were bigger. For example, tips would be padding your bra with Kleenex, putting something else in the bra to push the breasts up, or actually trying to grow them more using an exercise program or a special cream, or yes, exposing them to moonlight, apparently. So this was the era of the bras that were decidedly pointy in nature. And we are used to bras that follow the natural curvature of the female breast. But in the 1950s, it was like they needed them to be as upright and perky as possible. So in every era, there has been pressure on girls to strive for what is the currently held ideal of beauty. Not just adult women, but adolescent girls as well. In every single era, girls have been told, they have been socialized to desire that they should look a certain way. And another way of saying this is that in every era, girls have been restricted by their appearance. Now, if I was to ask you which kind of society you would prefer to grow up in as a girl, which kind of society you would prefer to go through adolescence in, one that is very restrictive and limited in a variety of ways, or one in which those restrictions no longer exist for the most part, certainly most, if not all of us, would probably say a more modern one that is less constrictive. But there is a flip side to this. We may look at all this and, of course, want to be less restricted, less constrained, and all of that. But developing from a girl to a woman did have some advantages historically compared to the present. Joan Bromberg is a historian and the author of a book called The Body Project: An Intimate History of American Girls. And in her book, Miss Bromberg acknowledges that absolutely in the 18th and 19th centuries in American society, girls were much more constricted, they were more sheltered. Even when it came to their own body, they were not provided information about how their own body would work. Specifically, she examines the 100 years from 1895 to 1995. So she doesn't deny that in many ways the lives of a girl was really lacking, and just being female was not very advantageous. But she does make a very good point, and that is that girls of those times also benefited from an entire range of organizations created solely to help them grow up. And the term that she uses is a protective umbrella. That historically, there were all these organizations that operated to provide support and guidance, this kind of protective umbrella for young women, such as the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, the Girl Scouts, the Campfire Girls. Now, yes, these organizations still exist, but not in the same manner they did then. And what all of these groups did at the time was connect girls with adult women outside of their family who provided what Miss Bromberg referred to as this protective umbrella. So that they would kind of mentor them and nurture them and in many ways guide them, which might sound a bit hokey, but it's true. Just like young women now, young women then did not feel they could always go to their family, even their mothers, for support and guidance. And these organizations really helped to fill the gap. And what they did was they really focused on trying to help young women develop self-assurance, develop confidence, develop feelings of being capable in various ways. And the adult women who are connected to these organizations would really mentor them, help them develop their character, encourage them to think about their future and take control of their future in whatever way they could. Now, yes, at this time, they definitely had a religious connotation to them, but keep in mind that was the norm at the time because North America was a much more religious place. So overall then, the author's point is that girls may not have to wear corsets anymore, and they certainly have more civil rights. But there were some benefits that no longer exist, historically speaking. Now, a huge criticism of this book is that it's focused on middle-class white girls, and that's it. The author makes one reference to an African-American girl, only one. She doesn't mention anybody else other than middle-class white women. So, very, very good point, though kind of an interesting perspective. And like I said, these organizations still exist, but not in the same manner that they did then.